Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pratt, and I'm the peacemonger. It is Saturday, the 28th of February, and a new war has just started, it seems, in Iran. And quite frankly, I'm deeply skeptical that this will do anything except shred the US's already waning reputation on the world stage. But today, we're not going to focus, on that early stages of that ill thought through kind of combat operation. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Count Michael von der Schulenburg, who's a member of the European Parliament, to talk about sort of peace and the need for peace in Europe, including to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. Michael, thank you so much for joining today.
No, thank you for having me. Yeah, lovely to talk to you. Yeah,
So you've just written to, I mean, you produced an excellent paper about the need for intra-European peace talks, but also you've written to kind of Kaya Kallas and Roberta Metsola to kind of
right.
push. Tell us a bit about your agenda and what you're trying to kind of get to with this initiative.
I think we have also to accept that Ukraine has lost the war. That's very important. Or let's say it's losing the war. And with every day the war continues, the situation for Ukraine will become worse. And I think we should all feel for the Ukrainians because they really suffered through this war. So I think that why this continued is because the EU Europeans, we should not forget, the Russians are also Europeans. They want to prolong the war. That's a very clear decision they made with the 90 billion and with the recent resolution they put through the European Parliament. It's a resolution which basically calls for continuation of the war until Russia capitulates. I mean, nothing else, nothing short of that. And that's so unrealistic. And I think that we have made now a peace proposal, which I made with a number of quite famous Germans together. The most famous one is probably the highest general we ever had in the German army, called Harald Kujat, and who sees the things exactly that I do. And we had the son of Willy Brandt, and we had Mr. Telčík, which doesn't say much to you, but he was the advisor to Helmut Kohl at the time of the
Mm.
unification. So he carries a lot of weight in Germany on foreign policy, and there's some others. And of course, this combination between me, UN, and the military makes it very interesting, I think. So I've written this article with him, with the general, and I've written now to the parliament and to the EU Commission and says, it's time to rethink your strategy because Ukraine is losing and Europe or EU is losing with it. So we have to have a change of the whole thing. Yeah, that's why we do this. Yeah.
Yeah. And in your letter, which I've read, is very good, and I'll post a link to it in the description for this video. One of the things you talk about is a complete departure from diplomacy, in the war. And you are a seasoned diplomat. You're a 35 years diplomat. You're kind of at the UN, very, very senior kind of roles, ambassador level.
And always in wars. I mean, I really did wars all my life. I mean, not
Yeah.
just being a headquarter person, talking to diplomats. No, I was in wars. No. Mhm.
Yeah, and of course, diplomats should end wars, not start them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you think explain or helps to explain this complete departure from diplomacy that we've seen, not just since the war in Ukraine has started? I mean, I saw it as far back as 2014 when I arrived in Moscow at the British Embassy. But what do you think explains this flight from diplomacy, this unwillingness to engage in diplomacy?
Uh, the first one is denial of reality. I mean, the EU Europeans are in complete denial of what happens. And the war is reality. And the war creates realities. Not that realities we necessarily want, but it creates realities. And you come to a point where you can't change this anymore. So you have to accept the outcome of a war. And we don't do this. And we don't do this. I think the reason is very deep in, especially among the Germans in the European Union, that they thought, in this new world of multipolar world, the European Union will be one of the three main global powers, at par with the United States and with China. We have to arm, we have to combine, we have to create from a loose union, we have to become a state, a super state, the United States of Europe or something like this one. The European Union, during the time I'm there, has assumed a lot of competencies, I mean, rights not given to them in the contracts that established the European Union, like on military, like on judging people, for instance. So I think we see here a very unfortunate development. They had thought that they would have a European Union that goes from the Black Sea to, actually starting with Georgia, if you want to, from Black Sea to the Atlantic, and the European Union that goes from the Mediterranean up to the North Pole. And they see this is now not going to happen. And the third power in this new world is not going to be the European Union, but Russia. And so I think when you hear all the time Russia is not allowed to win the war, they mustn't win the war, and if not, Russia sort of runs us over militarily. What they really mean is that they have lost the possibility of creating a European Union that is par with other big powers like China and the United States. And that is for the leadership is something they don't want to accept. But they will have to accept it because there's no way they can change the war anymore.
Yeah, I agree. But even great powers have to have diplomats, right? They have to, see to get along. I still don't understand why we hate diplomacy, but we also hate we well, and we don't want war either because we don't have enough troops to fight, but we don't want peace either. So, even the US, I mean, then right now they're discredited, you might say, because of what's happening in Iran. But China has diplomats, Russia has good diplomats. Why do we hate diplomacy? I don't, this is what I don't understand.
Yeah, yeah. Why did
I
we put Mrs.
understand the
Callas in charge of diplomacy? Somebody who is so hateful of Russia and somebody who is not even received by Mr. Rubio, the American foreign minister. I mean, she's completely isolated with her attitudes. I think behind this is a calculation which is wrong, of course, that we have to prolong the war. We are stronger. We have more economy than the Russians. And with all the sanctions, after a long time, Russia will have to go to its knees and will have to withdraw from all the territories, and we will be the winner in this war. So we think by continuing the war, this is the only way of winning. What they forget is that the United States has now almost completely withdrawn from the war, and that Europe itself doesn't have the financial or the economic uh, uh, harness to support them in this war. They don't have it, and they will not have it. Even with all the commitments they pronounce, there will be no coalition of the willing being sent into Ukraine. It will never happen. The security guarantees we talk about will never happen. This permanent financing of them will not happen anymore. I don't think even they are prepared to bring the Ukraine into the European Union, not to speak about NATO. So I think there is a lot of promises now made to Ukraine to continue the war, which is very, very sad because we betray actually the Ukrainians. When you are here in the parliament and you say they are losing the war, you will immediately get into your face. No, the opposite. Ukraine has taken the initiative. We have already killed 1 million Russians, and we know their economy is going down the drain. Maybe one more year, and the whole collapse, economic collapse in Russia. So there is this self-delusion which dominates the things, and I think in this self-delusion you are not able to think about diplomacy because diplomacy means that you have to somehow understand the other side. You have to respect the other side. You have to listen also to the other side. Otherwise, you can't negotiate. And I think we are so far off. And if you see the latest resolution in the European Parliament, I think 8 pages or so, I mean, it's a hate document. It's full of hate. And the facts don't fit, but it's full of hate. Anything they can think of what Russia is bad of is listed on 8 pages. But the problem is, of course, and I've seen many wars and negotiations, in the end, hate is a very bad advisor. And actually, the party in a war who explodes into hate is usually the loser. I mean, hate is usually the language of a loser, and they don't realize it. They don't want to accept it. I mean, if I say something in the parliament, I'm just screamed down, and I think I know more about wars than all the rest of the parliamentarians there. And I'm not radical at all. I'm not anti-European Union. I think in our own interest, we should end this war with our own interests. We have to talk to Russia, not because of Russia, but because of us. But it's not, we are not in this position. It is, I have never, not even in the Iran-Iraq war, which also a million people did, I've ever encountered a situation where the leadership is so close to rational talk. I mean, you have in the public always this hate, and the other one is guilty and the other one is bad, and so. But you could always talk in Iran. I was on the Iranian side at the time. You could always talk to people, and you could talk sense to people. But here, no, you can't. I haven't found a single person in the responsibility who would be prepared to talk to me. That's that's very
Yeah,
sad.
I think there's
But it's a
something.
symbol of a loser. The European Union is a loser. I also would say, and not because I hate the European Union, but because of an assessment. I think that the European Union, as it is now, will not survive the Ukraine war. There will have to be substantial changes, and the idea of a centralized state, I think, has died in the Ukraine war and not boom, not become a reality because of the war. So I think we all have to think what comes next in the European Union. And this is, for instance, very important to think about in Georgia also, no? What becomes of the European Union?
Yeah,
Can I let
exactly.
me say something to the Americans because it's so important also for
Yeah, please do.
people in your country. America has withdrawn from the Ukraine war. There was an article now in the Foreign Affairs which had the headlines, Ukraine is losing the war. Ukraine must trade territory for peace immediately, not waiting, because with every day they would lose more. It's a very blunt article which goes through the military strengths of each side, and it says in the middle. Now, many people have said it before, but what is important about this one is that Foreign Affairs is the mouthpiece of the foreign affairs people in the United States, not only the Republicans, of all. And for the editorial board to bring this in at this time means that they want to indicate that is the thinking in the United States, very different to the thinking in Europe. And that it is, and if you think about the Munich Security Conference, that Rubio didn't have the time to go to the meeting on Iraq and instead went on a meeting about Syria and didn't mention his speech, Ukraine war, I think, except with two phrases. It says everything. And when the fourth anniversary was in Kiev, um, you know, the Americans sent a very low-level diplomats to attend. Nobody important attended. So you couldn't make a bigger message that for the United States, Ukraine no longer is of any strategic value, and that will change the war very quickly.
Yeah, well, let's hope that it does. Let's hope that it helps to.
It does already. It does already. I mean, it does. Hope is not the right word because you know, you know, these Ukrainians suffer terribly. I mean, they lose most of the people, not the Russians. It's the logic of any war, and this war is not any different than other wars among states, is when you are on the losing side, if you have to withdraw from your defense positions and go backwards, that's when this country will always lose far more people, sometimes up to 10 times as much, historically, no? 10 times as much as the advancing party under these conditions. And I think that Ukraine must suffer enormously. And I think every life of any Ukrainian to be put in this war of untrained people being forced recruitment on the streets and having to go to a war, and then they don't come back anymore afterwards, or they come back in a terrible state. And I mean, we all have to end this war. And I accuse my colleagues here in the European Parliament and politicians that it's us who prolongs the war. Because if we make conditions that Ukraine should still become a member of NATO, Russia has to pay the reparations, has to withdraw from all the territories, has to go for Putin and all these people have to be put on trial. I mean, this is so ridiculous to make these demands, but it means, of course, that Russia can't make an agreement because they don't trust that this doesn't happen. They end the war and the Europeans do what they want with the rest of the Ukraine. So I think they have to continue. That's why they continue their land campaign. It's mostly because of the lack of trust we bring into these negotiations with an attitude of the Europeans that says that Russia should still capitulate. So we can't negotiate this. And Russia cannot negotiate with us under these conditions.
Yeah, exactly right. And I agree with you on the need for pan-European negotiations because the risk right now is that the EU is just turning into what is almost identical, frankly, to NATO in terms of its mission, in terms of its purpose. It's forgotten about the economic, social, and cultural, dimension. And if Ukraine joins the EU, and like you, I don't think it probably will, join the EU. But the point is, without a much bigger reset, a much bigger dialogue, including that embraces kind of Russia, will even if the war ends, we'll just be pressing the pause button, ahead of a much bigger war that involves continental Europe, because that's what the kind of elites in Brussels want to take us towards. I mean, what's your assessment? Tell us about this idea of a
Yeah,
pan-European.
that's why we wrote this. We know also that writing now a peace proposal for the Europeans has very little chance of being implemented. But we felt nonetheless that we should do that because in order to trigger the discussion, and even if I most likely don't get an answer from Mrs. Kallas or from Mrs. Metsola, I think I distributed it widely in the parliament. I think people will know that we have to change something. And the things which I argue or we argue is that with the American withdrawal, this becomes an inner European war, but where the big parties on this one is the European Union on one side and all these governments, and maybe the UK, but I think the UK is basically can't act anymore. And Russia, and these are both Europeans, and I think the appeal we make for peace negotiations is not the details we say what to negotiate about territory or security arrangements and all
Yeah.
this type of things. What we really want to say, that's what the article is about. What is a diplomacy dependent? How do you bring two parties to the table to negotiate that are so hatefully against each other? No, that's in most cases, most wars the case, but in this case, it's more than I've ever experienced, actually. But how do we get? And I think what we have all to remember that if we want to have peace we need to restore peace on the European continent. And for this one, we have to have a joint responsibility from Russia and the EU to come up with. And we say, it's basically two things we should agree on. First of all, we have to agree what the future of the Ukraine is, that these people must have a future. And, we want to have a sovereign, stable, independent, functioning Ukrainian state, even if it's somehow 20% smaller, but it has to somehow have to have a future in between Russia and the European Union. And the second thing is, of course, that we say that, we have to find a solution where both sides feel more secure. It's not the Article 5 security guarantees, but it's the whole package of the whole thing. And we have to create the basis of a pan-European security and peace architecture. And this is not, it sounds sort of very far away, but it is not, because in 1990, after the end of the Cold War, we signed the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. This charter is international law. It was signed by the Americans, Canadians, all the Europeans, and some of the Asian states. It is international law. And this has exactly the framework of how we should work in Europe together without military alliances. Interesting enough, NATO is not mentioned a single time in this document. NATO, which dominates now so much the discussion about the security, it was always said we should not have competing military alliances. We have to do that together. Security you can't divide. I mean, all the right things, and we have it. So why don't we go back to this one? And by the way, I don't know if Georgia had signed it. I don't think so, but that doesn't matter. It is important for Georgia to know what is in there, and because it will impact also on their security. So I think we have it all. So if we would follow this road here, the issue is, and I have a certain experience with this type of negotiations, is that you don't want both sides to sit as losers and winners against each other. You have to appeal that both sides have now responsibility for what comes in the future. It would create a more productive, a more positive framework and things like this one. I personally think that the Russians are prepared for this, but I can't see anybody in the EU, not Merz, not Macron, and not von der Leyen or these people, to be ready for this one. But they will have to come because Europe or the EU Europe must have a much greater interest to have a peace agreement than Russia has.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And for as much as we talk about the kind of the relative economic size, Europe doesn't have the available economic capacity, in comparison to Russia. France is massively, indebted. Germany is deindustrializing, and so on. So when people talk in terms of the pure size, they're forgetting that the fact that, debt levels across the European Union are such that actually that it's an irrelevant metric, anyway. But I mean, like you, I've always felt that actually the future should also involve, well, three things. How Europe and Russia kind of coexist and interrelate in the future, how Ukraine and Russia kind of coexist in the future, and then how all three can coexist within a pan sort of European security architecture. And that has to include other countries, by the way, on the periphery, like Turkey, for example, like countries in the Balkans, like Georgia, for example, rather than seeking to kind of federalize and just make the EU even larger. The EU simply cannot afford to incorporate Ukraine. It just doesn't have the budget for that. Turkey, and so on. How to have sovereign states that find ways through diplomacy to kind of coexist peacefully across Europe and Eurasia. That's to me seems the obvious way forward. I mean, what are your views?
Yeah, the big problem is who could negotiate on behalf of EU Europe? States? Mrs. Kallas surely not, and Mrs. von der Leyen surely not either. So I think that's really the issue. And also, I think that the dream of having a super state EU will not materialize. The European Union is not very much liked in European countries. We have only now 50% of people voting to the European Parliament, 50% of all those entitled to vote. And that is only because 30% of them vote for parties who really don't like the EU. So I think that we have not much of a support. So I think that I don't think it will come from there. No, for for Georgia, the situation is very, very different, I think, and uh, the end of the war in Ukraine, and we can. It's just a question how the end comes is extremely important for a country like Georgia because you have the fault lines or these geopolitical fault lines you have in your politics in your own country, no? And it gives you a chance, Georgia, to soften the differences between opposition and government because certain options are not there anymore for you. And you have to say, in Georgia, I think, has to think about what its future is. And the greatest mistake Georgia could do that if it tries to play geopolitics, it's too small for that. And I think if I've read before we have this on the arguments of the opposition and so on, and I thought, that sounds to me all that they play actually geopolitics there on Georgian soil. I think you shouldn't do that. I think you have to come down and probably is maybe even the time to have negotiations with the oppositions and think about what is the future of Georgia in this all context. Georgia has you can say on one side, it's sort of in the edge of the European Union, far out actually. But you can also say that Georgia is in the crossroad between the
Mm.
European Union and BRICS countries, no, between Europe and Asia. So there is a huge advantage also for it. And if I were Georgians, I would reconsider what type of alliances I want to have and what is really to Georgia's advantage, because that's the only way the Georgians should think. And since you're very clever people there, I think they have to find out themselves. And I hope only that considering already that Georgia has all the problems with South Ossetia and Abkhazia and so I think that small country that you have what you have is to be clever and see how the changing geopolitical situations creates flexibility and certain open doors for Georgia to benefit from it and
Yeah.
to, or equally important, try to prevent the risks which come with it. And that for this one, Georgians must be far more together. Maybe they have to create something like a sort of a council for the future of Georgia, in which they take people from all sides in and, rather concentrate what is the future rather than all the past and things like this one. So,
Yeah. I mean,
so I think it's very important. The changes taking place, and I would even include on this one the war in Iran, has huge impacts, fallouts on small countries like Georgia. And they have to be clever. They have to be clever. They shouldn't spend all their energies on fighting each other on silly things. And they have to be clever how they guarantee the future of Georgia, their children, grandchildren. There is a certain responsibility now in this context, and I hope they know what they're doing. Mhm.
yeah, I mean, I think Georgia is a classic example of actually the challenge we face in democracy across Europe, right now, that actually left to its own devices, um, democracy can actually, does have the potential to work quite well, as we saw in a recent by-election in the UK 2 days ago, where the Green Party won it, and the mainstream parties, the kind of pro-war kind of mainstream parties have been relegated. Now, I'm not saying I support Green, I support Reform, but the point was that actually voters, have decided. The challenge you see in Georgia is that there's way too much foreign interference in the internal affairs of others,
Exactly.
in the internal
Exactly.
affairs of other states.
Exactly. The problem of a country the size of Georgia, because it has a huge value where their geography is, attracts a lot of foreign influence through NGOs, through funding this politician, and things like this one. And I hope only that with the changes, and that was of course an open ball game when it looked that the European Union was on the winning side, but now they're on the losing side, and Russia's on the winning side, and Georgia shares with Russia borders and the Black Sea and things like this one. So I think that all these things taken into consideration needs now a Georgia where the Georgians themselves concentrate on what their future should be. And I think I would cut off all these ideological links there and financial links, of course, because they're so detrimental for deciding what your future is. And I think Georgians are clever enough to decide it themselves. They don't need a bloody German NGO there or some very aggressive ambassador who tells them what to do and not to do. You don't need this, and I think we should do it. And then maybe it helps us also to smoothen out all these very emotional and deeply seated differences which have developed in Georgia since independence, and Georgia could sail into smoother water.
Yeah.
And
Well, and the thing
but
is,
the first thing to do, if I may say, because I know a little bit about these things, is we should all agree in Georgia to to watch our language. language is a war driver, is a conflict driver. So let's all smoothen our language, even if we have different objectives. And suddenly you will see that one comes much, much closer.
Yeah, exactly right. And of course, difference is the benzene that or the gasoline that drives democracy, right? I mean, the difference
Yeah,
is okay, so long as it.
absolutely.
Uh,
And it's
s-
wanted, but in a constructive way. Which
yeah,
way is a better one? And not to eliminate one or the other. No, often a compromise is a better solution than a well thought through compromise is a better solution than, this one has right and the other one not. But I mean, for this one, you have to think. Georgia has to think without being influenced constantly by foreign powers or foreign ambassadors. I think you have some very noisy
the
ambassadors, and
German.
didn't want to mention him, but
Peter Fisher. Yes, no, exactly. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
and actually, in fairness, the British as well. Uh, you
I'm
know,
sure. I'm sure.
yeah, yeah.
And that's the problem in Europe. Our ambassadors have become basically warmongers and not anymore diplomats. No, I mean they talk sometimes if they are support to make the way free for war. So I think they miss a little bit
Yeah,
their
that's
vacation.
exactly
No,
right. I mean, like you, I mean, but we also see political interference in elections in EU states as well, like Romania
absolutely.
and like Hungary. I mean, clearly nobody wants Orban to win, but
Romania. I mean, and we had an observer. One of my colleagues went to the colleague I wanted like to bring also to Georgia. She was an election observer, one of them in the group, and she made a minority report in Moldova. I mean, it was a completely cheated elections. And I've done a lot of elections in the UN. I was politically responsible for these elections and referenda and all these type of things. I mean, in the UN, we'd never allowed such an election to go through. But that's what we do. And we give them 1.4 billion euros for that. And it's not good because it is, in the end, not a solution.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. But I think like
And the problem you have in Georgia, probably too, I would say.
yeah, no, it's exactly the same problem. But I mean, I think the case of Hungary is illustrative of the fact that actually nation states want to regain control back from the EU superstructure. The EU kind of Death Star, to use a Star Wars analogy. There was a Harvard professor recently wrote a piece in Project Syndicate saying that Europe's problem is that yes, they should give more economic powers back to the nation states, like countries like Hungary, but to do that, actually, they need a role. So therefore, they need to centralize common foreign and security and defense policy even more. I thought, well, no, that's absolutely the last thing they should do. The EU should reduce much further its competence and hand much more competence back to nation states. And without that, as you say, it won't survive the war in Ukraine. I mean, that's just a
I
very
mean, look at this.
plain
I
of it.
mean, look at big states, and because I've now a lot to do with them, and because I wrote the brochure about the UN Charter. And the interesting thing is, in BRIC states, I get a lot of compliments and that come back, but not in NATO states. They somehow don't want the UN Charter. And and I think small states like Georgia, I mean, it would be a collective suicide to say you don't want to have the UN Charter. Equal sovereignty. I mean, the protection of non-interference, the keeping to treaties, and all these things protects especially small states from larger states, which have taken now so much power without asking anybody. So I think that's something you should be much more seen also in Georgia, why that's important. And then, the BRIC states have it in their constitution, and they have not created a NATO, although their economy is larger. They have more technology now, and the demography is on their side. So I think they're much larger than the European Union now, and more dynamic. And so I think that is something. Georgia would should look at. And if it's not want rather to be a sort of the bridge between European Union and the big states, then becoming a sort of a European Union small state, which is told what to do and not to do. And yeah, this flexibility creates a lot of things. The trade issues, the investment in ports and roads, and I
Yeah.
mean, this is all would be good for Georgia, and yeah, I think that it has to look in this direction too, and not the NATO direction. I mean, NATO is losing another war just now. I mean, like all the other wars, and I can tell you, we will also lose a war in Iran at an enormous human cost, but we will lose it in the end. This is terrible. I mean, that we want to solve everything militarily, and I think Georgia has to stay out of this.
Yeah,
Just stay out of this.
I completely agree. And the whole basis of the United Nations Charter was the concept of sovereignty, sovereign states. And the reason why NATO and the EU don't like it is because they are sort of claiming sovereignty over their member states. And so the United Nations Charter kind of interferes with their sort of assumption of sovereignty over the states, that are members of their club. And I think that's why, that they want their rules, not the UN's rules. And I think that is the fundamental
Yeah.
philosophical, intellectual clash.
And the sad thing is that the UN Charter and the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, these two fundamental documents for the United Nations, would not have existed without the Americans. It was a present by the Americans, especially by President Roosevelt and his wife, because she was very involved with the human rights issue, to humankind, to all of us. And they are the one who destroy it now. I mean, this is so sad. And and it is, in my view, when we have all these wars over this, there will come a time. We will all remember that it is what Trump says. Even international treaties and these things don't exist anymore. But I think much worse is what the Prime Minister from Canada said in Davos, where he said, "Oh, finally, all this illusion about having common law or having international law. Now we know it's only the one who has a faster pistol, and that's why he calls on Europe and some Asian countries to build an alliance to be at equal power with China and I think it's really awful. I mean, it's awful for a man like this to say such a thing. I consider his talks by far more dangerous than Trump's talk, by the way. And to call international law an illusion, people will always live by agreeing on how they want to live together. And that's what makes these rules. National rules, they are laws. International rules, they are much less, of course, implementable, but there has to be an agreement. We want to prevent war. We want to prevent things like in Gaza. And for this one, all we have pre-established rules. And this is a great achievement of the United Nations. And I mean not the administration United Nations in New York. I mean the United Nations that all 193 countries have agreed on certain issues that they would negotiate rather go to war and things like this one. And unfortunately, it is the NATO countries who now don't obey it anymore. And I think, and that's very important for Georgia to understand, I think is because NATO countries are on the losing side. They are so used from colonial times that they realize it's not anymore the case. And that's also the reason for your other questions, why we don't have diplomacy, because we just don't want to accept it.
Yeah, and and it goes deep into our education system. We've stopped investing in the capabilities of our political class, of our diplomatic sort of class, and increasingly our institutions are kind of governed by people who've never really had real world experience. I mean, like Kaya Kallas, Roberta Metsola, they just appear to be kind of empty careerists from minnow states, with tremendous powers but no real elected mandate, to act.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's a systemic problem that we face in our societies too, that we're not getting ordinary people with real life skills aren't able to thrive in diplomacy and in politics, and then we end up with these bland, homogenizing kind of characters who want us all to be same. But unfortunately, that's not what the real world
Worst
is.
case is UK. I mean, where you come from. I mean, Starmer becoming prime minister of UK. UK with so much tradition of big prime ministers, foreign ministers. And we might not all like them. We might not all have liked their policies. But I mean, now you have a. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't employ him when he applies for an assistant with me and things like this. But I mean, I cannot understand how these people come to the top.
Yeah, no, neither can I. But of course, we also had Liz Truss, and we had Bush's-
Yeah, you have a string of it. Yes. I mean,
unfortunately, that has.
UK, which once ruled the world. I mean, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, I think.
the it's not only that we don't like their policy. What is much worse, that we have such a low level of education of these people, such a low level of statesmanship and things like this one. There is none anymore. Also not with Mr. Merz, by the way. So,
Yeah, no, Merz is, but then they all seem to be as bad as each other. You know, Europe is lacking to statecraft and
yeah.
statespeople. Uh,
I
uh,
mean, I probably would not have voted for de Gaulle. I have a rather different ideas about the word, but at least he had a personality. What is this one? What we have now, Mr. Macron, he changes every 2 days. He says something else, and then he is only has a support in the country of less than 20%. I mean, he can't even put a budget through the parliament and things like this one. I mean, we are really in bad shape, and we make so noisy declarations. And if you are there on the edge of Europe, like in Georgia. Look at what they all say. Look, what of this one is really true? What of this one they can really implement? Nothing. I tell you, it's all empty. I tell here to the Iranians, because I still have contact with the Iranians, I said, these people betray you. Huh?
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, we had because of the UK also, we had this television things about the meeting in the Elysee Palace of the Coalition of the Willing. Big pictures, all kissing Zelensky, all around. And in the end, Starmer and Macron signed it as if they were still world powers of the First World War, but they are not. And nothing of the things they will implement. They are just unable to do this because they are not supported by the United States and they're opposed by Russia. So they can't do that. And still they make all this fuss in declaring it's all show, it's nothing real in this whole thing. And that will pay. We will pay with this. We will pay with a decline in our economy. We will pay with this with loss in global governance systems. I mean, we will not be asked anymore. We lose our credibility. In the end, we lose also our social systems. And so it's very bad for us. It's very bad.
yeah. It is. The EU will not survive. This war in Ukraine. I actually
At
wanted.
least not in the present stage. We prepare now with some of intellectuals in Germany a counter proposal we call a manifest for the future of the European Union. There will be always something of the European Union, but it will be very, very different of what it is now. It will not the European Union of Mrs. von der Leyen's, definitely not.
Yeah, it should be slimmed down because there is a.
Absolutely.
I
We
mean,
have
I
here 40,000 bureaucrats here in 40,000. And then I get a response from Mrs. Kallas, to our things about this rule of law, which is of such low. I mean, I know what bureaucracies are like, but it's of such low standard, these answers. Then I think, what are all these people doing? They're earning a fortune. I mean, much more than we do.
yeah.
They're here. And then they don't work themselves. They probably all have consultants. So the whole number doubles, I would assume. I don't know, but
Consultants,
something like this one.
coaches
It's
getting
this
1,000.
bureaucracy. Now the new budget, they want to have 2,600 more posts. Uh, they need a whole two more buildings, and I mean,
Yeah.
it would be so sad. I mean, one can actually laugh about it. It is so terribly, terribly unprofessional, the whole thing.
No, but you're right though. I mean, what people don't understand about NATO in particular, but also about the EU, that they are bureaucracies, and bureaucracies need to exist, and bureaucracies need to gain more powers and grow. And like, when I grew up, I'm very much pro-European. I grew up in your lovely country, Germany as a kid. My dad was in the British Army at the time.
Yeah,
And I remember, going through border checkpoints just to go shopping in the Netherlands at the weekend or just for day trips and things like that.
yeah,
It wasn't that intrusive, actually. It's fairly straightforward, but still, but I also remember being able to drive all the way from the border between Poland and Ukraine and Calais when I drove back
yeah.
at the end of my overseas posting, and how that sort of economic, social, and cultural opening up really transformed Europe as a continent of peace and the huge benefits from that. So I do think the EU can be great.
Of
It
course.
just
That's also why we want to write this. We don't want to destroy the whole thing.
Yeah.
No, we only feel we went into a terribly wrong directions by militarizing us, by not speaking to others, by behaving like we are already a great power, by putting sanctions out which hurt ourselves, all this type of things. Of course, there are many things which are good, and we should preserve. So that's not a question of destroying it all things. It's just to put it on a different footing and slim the bloody thing down. I mean, it's
Yeah, no,
even
I
if I
agree.
lose my job, but I'm so old now that it doesn't really matter anymore.
Well, slim it down. On that optimistic note, Michael von Schulenburg, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining today. Hope my watchers have found it interesting. I certainly have. I agree pretty much with everything that Michael has said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
this morning, Europe has got far too large and actually needs to get back to, diplomacy, mutual coexistence, both within Europe itself, but also with countries neighboring Europe, ending this stupid and costly war, in Ukraine and searching for peace. So please like and subscribe to this channel if you continue to find these videos helpful. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you very much peace. And Michael, thank you so much for
Oh,
joining us.
thank you very much. Thank you. All the best.